Flames licked the black sky above Laurel Holler, casting the mountain ridges in trembling orange. By morning, 3 sisters would stand accused of erasing their own bloodline from history. The Appalachian backcountry of 1842 was no stranger to hardship. Men vanished in timber camps, cabins burned in winter storms, and children were lost to fever. But neighbors would later whisper that nothing compared to the night the triplets of Laurel Holler turned their rage inward. Their silence, eerie as an empty church, was the first warning. Their knives and fire were the second. The holler never recovered. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let us know. If stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear is one of Appalachia's darkest buried accounts. The triplets, Rosa, Ruth, and Rebecca, were born on a frost-bitten dawn in February of 1826. The midwife claimed they did not cry, only breathed in shallow unison like 3 reeds in a single current. Their father, Samuel Dalton, a stubborn settler with calloused hands and a temper sharpened by whiskey, saw them as both blessing and curse. 3 mouths, 1 womb, he muttered, and from the start the holler marked them as different. The Dalton cabin squatted against the hillside above a creek that gurgled year-round with iron-red water. Inside, the smell of pine smoke mingled with boiled turnips. Outside, the ground was stony, refusing corn except in thin rows. Survival required constant barter with neighbors, yet the triplets grew close, sharing not only chores, but an uncanny rhythm. They moved together, eyes following the same point, words spoken in fragments as if finishing each other's thoughts. By the age of 10, their mother claimed she could not tell which sister had entered the room until she looked directly at them. And yet, something deeper stirred. One spring, tools went missing from sheds, later found snapped in half as if by deliberate trial. A calf was discovered tethered to a fence post, starving within reach of grass. When questioned, the sisters answered in the same flat tone. We wanted to see what would happen. Their reputation hardened. Children at the one-room schoolhouse kept their distance. Neighbors whispered that the Dalton triplets carried some old mountain curse. Others suggested their silence came from hearing too much in a house where Samuel's belt sang louder than hymns. By adolescence, the sisters spoke little but watched everything. They learned to read the forest, to track animals, and, more dangerously, to track people. The stakes for the holler were growing. This was no ghost tale spun around a fire. These were flesh and blood daughters whose grievances would ignite into something no one could contain. If kin could turn on kin, who in the mountains was safe? A rare surviving entry from a neighbor's journal dated August 10th, 1842, reads, "Past the Dalton place. Smoke from the chimney, though the heat pressed heavy. Saw the 3 girls standing in the yard, still as fence posts. Eyes following me till I turned the bend. Could not shake the chill. Es Sprake." That August was the hottest in memory. The creek shrank to a trickle, crops wilted, and tempers flared. Samuel's drinking grew worse, his rages more violent. One night, Rosa was seen at the spring house with bruises climbing her neck like purple vines. No one intervened. In Appalachia, a man's household was his dominion, and neighbors turned away from what they heard through thin cabin walls. But silence sharpens like flint. The sisters began stockpiling tinder, dry pine shavings hidden beneath floorboards. Knives disappeared from neighbors' tool racks and reappeared honed to a sheen. Still, no alarm was raised. "Girls is strange, but harmless," said old Eli Perkins, a farmer who once traded beans for their mother's quilts. What would you do, standing at the edge of such signs? Dismiss them as children's mischief, or prepare for what those blades might carve? The Night of Knives began on August 21st. The air pressed thick with cicada drone, the smell of kerosene leaking from a jug left near the hearth, and the rasp of crickets in the grass. Samuel had returned drunk from a logging camp, cursing debts, while their mother knelt by the hearth stirring beans. Witnesses later swore they saw smoke rising far too early for supper. Neighbors heard shouts echoing down the ridge, then silence sharper than any scream. By the time the first flames crept from the cabin roof, the triplets were seen standing side by side in the yard, faces pale in the glow. Some swore they carried knives, glinting red with reflection. Others claimed they held nothing at all, only stared at the fire consuming their kin. The cabin collapsed before midnight, sending sparks into the trees. No bodies were ever recovered, intact enough for certainty. Some claimed Samuel perished inside. Others swore they saw the mother stumbling into the woods, never to return. 12 neighbors gathered at dawn, walking the singed clearing where the Dalton house once stood. They found the sisters seated on a log, soot streaking their faces, silent as ever. Not a word passed their lips, but their eyes seemed to ask a question no one dared answer. The holler never forgot that silence. But what happened next, what the sisters did in the weeks that followed, would carry the horror beyond one household and into every cabin for miles. The knives were only the beginning. Dawn broke over Laurel Holler with a haze of wood smoke, the scent of charred pine clinging to the air. The ground still crackled underfoot, where embers smoldered, and the Dalton cabin lay in ruin, beams blackened, roof caved in like a chest crushed by unseen hands. A rooster crowed from a nearby fence post, indifferent to the wreckage. The neighbors gathered in silence, boots shifting on scorched soil. They were mountain folk, accustomed to hardship, yet the sight unsettled them. No accident could explain the precise way kindling had been stacked beneath the hearth. And then there were the sisters, Rosa, Ruth, and Rebecca, sitting together on a log, their dresses ash-stained, hands folded neatly in their laps. They did not cry. They did not speak. They simply watched. This mattered because fear in a tight-knit settlement spreads faster than fire. If kin could destroy kin, who was safe within these hills? Sheriff Daniel Price rode up from the county seat later that afternoon, his horse kicking up dust that hung heavy in the summer air. He dismounted and surveyed the ruin. "Which one of you lit the flame?" he asked, his voice flat but his eyes sharp. None of the sisters answered. They turned their heads in unison toward the creek, as though something far more important waited beyond his questions. A witness statement, dated August 22, 1842, preserved in the courthouse ledger reads, "They would not speak. Looked at me as though I was already gone from this earth. 3 faces, 1 expression. Could not tell them apart. I swear the hush was worse than screams. Neighbors muttered theories, an accident sparked by Samuel's drunken rage, a cooking fire left untended, or even lightning despite the clear skies. But among themselves, they whispered another possibility, that the sisters had taken matters into their own hands. No one moved to place them under arrest. In that era, law bent around geography. What happened deep in a holler often stayed buried there. Besides, most neighbors carried their own secrets. Moonshine stills, debts unpaid, feuds half settled. To accuse the sisters meant inviting questions no one wanted asked. So the sheriff rode back down the mountain, leaving the triplets sitting silent among the ashes. But the mountains listen. That night, smoke drifted once more, though no house had burned. Instead, a chicken coop belonging to Eli Perkins collapsed in sparks, feathers, and timber glowing red. The birds lay scattered, necks twisted not by fire but by knives. Coincidence or escalation? The next morning, Rosa appeared at the Perkins homestead, her dress freshly washed, but her boots still carrying soot. She asked for salt, her voice quiet, almost polite. Eli's wife handed it over, her hand shaking. Behind Rosa, Ruth and Rebecca stood at the fence, their eyes fixed not on the house, but on Eli himself. No words passed between them, but the message was unmistakable. Fear became the new neighbor in Laurel Holler. The triplets began to roam the ridge at night, Lantern light flickered through trees where no path existed. Some said they carried buckets of water to the creek. Others claimed the buckets were filled with kerosene. In the distance, dogs barked and then fell silent. Chickens vanished. Gardens were trampled. Yet when dawn came, the sisters returned home as though nothing had changed. What would you do, faced with 3 silent girls whose presence felt like a storm waiting to break? Call the sheriff again, or bar your doors, and hope the darkness passed you by. The silence spread. Families stopped gathering at one another's cabins after church. Mothers forbade their children from playing near the Dalton clearing. The holler grew tense, each family watching smoke from their chimneys like a lifeline, praying it rose in peace rather than destruction. But silence sharpens like a blade. By September, the triplets had turned from neighbors' livestock to their kin. Cousin Jeremiah Dalton lived 3 miles downriver in a cabin built of cedar logs, its walls smelling of resin and fresh-cut wood. One night, neighbors saw fireflies swarming unnaturally thick near his fields. The next morning, Jeremiah's barn stood gutted, hay blackened, the boards dripping with dew that carried the sour tang of kerosene. Inside, tools lay scattered: saws, axes, knives, all missing their handles, as if deliberately ruined. Jeremiah swore vengeance, but by the week's end, he was gone. His cabin door swung open, bed empty, dishes still set for supper. Some said he fled into Tennessee to escape his cousins. Others whispered the sisters had dealt with him more directly. The truth never surfaced. His absence became another scar on the holler. 3 words echoed in the settlement. The sisters watched. One evening in late September, as autumn leaves crunched underfoot and wood smoke mingled with the sharp scent of apples rotting in an orchard, the Perkins family gathered for supper. Their youngest boy swore he saw figures watching from the tree line, 3 shapes moving together, their faces hidden by dusk. The parents dismissed it as nerves. Yet when the family rose from prayer, the window shutters clattered against the wall, though no wind stirred. The triplets' silence became its own language. No one heard them speak, yet messages were delivered. A dead crow left on a doorstep, a carved cross etched into a barn door, a line of stones arranged neatly across a trail. The mountain carried their intent. Neighbors debated whether to act. Old Martha Jenkins, whose cabin sat nearest the ruined Dalton place, said, "Girls is cursed, sure enough, but curse or no, they're flesh and blood. Better we keep watch than meddle." Most agreed. Few dared challenge the sisters openly. Fear breeds complicity, and so the holler chose silence. A letter dated October 3rd, 1842, from a traveling preacher recorded, "I stopped near Laurel Holler. Folk here skittish as rabbits. Would not speak of the 3 maidens except to cross themselves. Said the devil walks in their likeness. Left the valley by dawn. Could not abide the eyes on me from the trees. By the first frost, the triplets moved more boldly. They walked into church one Sunday, dressed in white calico, their hair braided the same, their steps matching. They sat together on the front pew, silent, while the preacher's voice wavered through the sermon. No one dared sit near them. After the final hymn, they filed out, leaving behind the faint smell of smoke on their clothes. The holler never prayed the same way again. What awaited them beyond that church door would test every neighbor's patience and every family's sense of survival. Because once knives and fire had been turned against kin, what boundaries remained? The next target was no barn, no cabin, but the holler itself. The first snow of 1842 came early, dusting the ridges with white, while the creek below ran black and swollen from autumn rains. The air carried 3 scents at once: wood smoke, wet leaves, and something acrid: kerosene, faint yet undeniable. Laurel Holler braced for winter, but no one braced for the triplets. The silence of Rosa, Ruth, and Rebecca had become its own terror. Families barred doors at dusk, kept lamps burning through the night, and whispered prayers before sleep. Yet still, their neighbors woke to find chicken coops torn open, smoke rising from sheds, or strange markings carved into fence posts. The sisters no longer confined their warnings to kin, they had widened their circle. This mattered because when fear spreads across an entire valley, suspicion corrodes trust. And once neighbors doubt one another, the holler itself begins to die. By November, children refused to walk to the schoolhouse alone. One girl told her mother she'd heard singing near the Dalton ruins a hymn, she claimed, sung in 3 voices that never wavered. The mother hushed her, but the story spread. Others admitted they too had heard melodies drifting down the creek at twilight. Was it worship, a warning, or madness blooming in young minds? The triplets began appearing on roadsides, standing together in silence as wagons rolled past. They did not beg, they did not threaten. They only watched until the driver disappeared down the trail. A blacksmith traveling through described it in a letter dated November 12, 1842. 3 girls, same height, same stare, stood like mourners, but no grave in sight. I clutched my Bible, but felt no comfort. Neighbors debated action. Some argued they should gather a posse, march to the Dalton clearing, and demand answers. Others urged caution. They've lost too much, old Eli Perkins insisted. Best to leave 'em be. Fire burns out on its own. Yet fire, once kindled, seeks new fuel. The Perkins family would soon regret that counsel. On the night of November 20th, their barn went up in flames. The sound came first, the crackle of dry timber, then the panicked whinny of horses. The smell of burning hay carried through the holler, drawing families from their beds. By the time they reached the Perkins farm, the structure had collapsed in a red roar. The animals inside 2 mules, a milk cow, and 3 pigs were gone. Eli himself stood with a bucket in each hand, his arms trembling, sweat freezing on his brow. Beside him, his wife clutched their youngest son, and across the field, 3 figures stood motionless against the firelight. The sisters. They held no torches. They carried no tools. Yet the sight of them against the flames was enough. Neighbors whispered, "The Dalton curse walks." Eli dropped his buckets, his face ashen. The sisters turned and melted into the tree line without a word. What would you do, standing in that field? Chase them into the dark, or accept the fire as your warning? The holler chose silence again, but silence sharpens like flint. By December, rumors reached beyond Laurel Holler. Travelers through the Blue Ridge told of the 3 witches of Dalton's place. Some called them avengers, punishing men who beat wives and children. Others claimed they were demons. The truth blurred until every barn fire, every missing animal, every sickness was blamed on them. Fear became their legacy before their story was half told. Yet not all saw them as villains. A widow named Sarah Carver, who lived with her 2 daughters in a cabin of rough oak, confessed to a neighbor that she'd found food left at her door, cornmeal, salt pork, even dried apples on nights when her children went hungry. "I never saw who set it down," she said, "but I felt 3 sets of eyes in the dark. I reckon I know who it was." So were the sisters destroyers or providers? Both? The holler wrestled with the contradiction. On Christmas Eve, church bells rang faintly from the valley below. Families gathered in their cabins, reading scripture by lamplight, singing hymns against the cold. At the Perkins place, a child spotted 3 figures in the snow just beyond the yard. They stood bareheaded, their dresses thin, their hair dusted white with flakes. When the family looked out again, the figures were gone, leaving only footprints that stopped at the creek's edge. 3 sets of prints, then nothing. The following morning, frost coated the Dalton ruins like crystal. Smoke rose from a small fire ring nearby, though no one had camped there. In the ashes lay 3 knives, their blades blackened but sharp. Around them, Stones had been arranged in a perfect circle. Some saw ritual, others saw preparation. All saw a message. What message? That the triplets had finished their vengeance, or that it had only begun? The winter deepened. January winds howled through the ridges, carrying scents of pine pitch and frozen earth. The holler huddled close, avoiding the Dalton clearing, whispering of what spring might bring. Yet the sisters remained unseen, their silence stretching longer than before. Some dared to hope the curse had passed, but hope dies quickly in a place where the mountains themselves seem to listen, because on February 6, 1843, the triplets' 17th birthday, Laurel Holler awoke to find every door unlatched, every gate unhooked, every hearth cold. Families swore they had locked up tight the night before, yet something had moved through the valley, unseen, and left its mark. And on each doorstep, carved into the wood with a steady hand, was the same sign, 3 lines crossing at the center like a star. Neighbors panicked. Some prayed. Others prepared rifles, but no shots were fired, for fear of what might follow. The legend of the triplets grew sharper that day, carried not just in whispers, but in the etched scars of every cabin door. The holler waited, and the sisters, silent as stone, prepared their next move. The wind carried a low moan across Laurel Holler that morning in February, a sound like a bow dragging across a fiddle string. It mingled with the smell of thawing earth and the iron tang of creek water rushing high from melted snow. Each family stepped outside their cabins, only to recoil in dread. 3 lines, carved deep into every door. The triplets had not vanished into the mountains, as many hoped. They had returned in silence, leaving behind a symbol no one could mistake. To some, it resembled a star. To others, a brand. But to all, it meant one thing. They could enter any home they wished. This mattered because in a world where locks meant safety, the sisters had stripped away illusion. Every man, woman, and child in the holler knew now that the Dalton triplets walked as shadows through their lives. Sheriff Daniel Price rode up again from the county seat, summoned by panicked letters scrawled in shaky hands. He knocked on doors, inspected the carvings, questioned the families. "You sure this weren't boys playing tricks?" he asked old Eli Perkins. But Eli only shook his head, pointing to the precision of the marks. Too straight, too measured, too deliberate. A scrap of testimony survives in the courthouse records, dated February 7, 1843. "They could have killed us all in our sleep if they'd wanted. That's what's worse. They wanted us to know they could." The sheriff considered forming a posse, yet none volunteered. Who would ride against 3 girls who could move unseen and carve their will into your very home? He rode back down the ridge empty-handed, leaving the holler to its fate. That night, the sisters were seen walking the ridgeline against the pale wash of moonlight. 3 figures in single file, their dresses white with frost. They did not hurry. They did not hide. They simply moved, visible to anyone watching. It was less an act of stealth than of declaration. Fear became the new law. Neighbors began making choices, born not of reason, but of survival. Eli Perkins, once their staunchest defender, packed his family and left before dawn, abandoning his fields to weeds. Others considered the same, but the mountains offered few safe havens. Moving meant starvation, as surely as staying meant dread. So most endured, clinging to routine as though work and worship could shield them. But silence sharpens like a knife. By March, livestock disappeared one by one. A cow from the Jenkins place, 2 goats from Sarah Carver's pen, chickens from half a dozen yards. Some families whispered that the triplets had stolen food to survive the winter. Others said the missing animals were sacrifices for something darker. On March 12th, the Carver girls found a bundle on their porch. Inside lay feathers tied with twine, a small knife, and a hunk of smoked venison wrapped in cloth. The meat was food, Yet the knife carried meaning. A gift? A warning? Both? Sarah buried the bundle, but the story spread. What would you do? Accept the offering and eat, or refuse it and risk offense? The holler chose silence again. 3 words echoed through the valley. The sisters watched. On March 20th, church bells rang as usual, their sound echoing through still air scented with damp moss. Families gathered for Sunday worship, though attendance had thinned since autumn. Halfway through the sermon, the doors swung wide. The triplets entered, dressed in black calico, their hair plaited tight, their boots coated with mud. They walked to the front pew, sat side by side, and stared straight ahead. The preacher's voice faltered. Mothers clutched children tighter. Eli Perkins was gone by then, but his absence left the pews more hollow. The girls did not sing, did not bow their heads, did not close their eyes. They only watched. After the benediction, the congregation filed past them in silence. No one spoke. No one met their eyes. Outside, the smell of kerosene clung faintly to their dresses. Whether anyone noticed or admitted to noticing, they kept it to themselves. The holler prayed harder that night, though prayers seemed to echo unanswered through the ridges. A traveling peddler later wrote in his ledger on March 29, 1843, "Cabins shuttered, folk tight-lipped, told me not to go near the Dalton clearing, said the 3 daughters were witches. I saw them myself by the creek, eyes like cold coals. They didn't speak, didn't need to." By April, fear had hardened into ritual. Families began hanging charms above their doors. Horseshoes, braided corn husks, sprigs of cedar, some carved crosses into beams, hoping to counter the sisters' 3-lined mark. But the holler knew no charm could keep them out, because on April 15th, one family tested the limits. Thomas Abbott, a miller from 2 ridges over, laughed off the stories. "Girls can't rule grown men," he said, dismissing his neighbor's warnings. He nailed new boards over his door, carving his initials into the wood as if to erase their symbol. That night, his mill wheel stopped turning. By morning, the stream had been dammed with rocks arranged in precise stacks. His grain spoiled. His livelihood collapsed. When Abbott returned to his cabin, the boards over his door had been removed and laid neatly on the ground, the 3 lines carved deeper than before. Defiance had been answered. What happened to Abbott after that was never recorded in full. Some said he fled west. Others claimed he stayed and wasted away. His name faded from records within a year. The mark on his door, however, remained until the cabin itself rotted into the ground. The holler never forgot. By late spring, neighbors realized the sisters' vengeance was not random. It followed rules, though none could decipher them fully. Some families were spared entirely, others marked again and again. Was it bloodlines, old grudges, or some logic known only to the triplets themselves? The silence became unbearable. On May 3rd, a group of men gathered at the Jenkins barn. They argued whether to confront the sisters, to drive them out, or worse. But before a decision could be reached, the barn door swung wide. There they stood, Rosa, Ruth, and Rebecca, 3 shadows framed in daylight. They did not raise weapons. They did not speak. They only watched until the men scattered like leaves before a storm. And as the triplets walked back toward the Dalton clearing, their bare feet silent on the dirt path, the holler realized the truth. The knives and fire had been only the beginning. The summer of 1843 came heavy with heat. Cicadas screamed from the treetops, the creek dropped to a sluggish trickle, and the holler smelled of damp moss, sweat, and fear. Crops shriveled in the fields. Families whispered that the land itself had turned sour under the shadow of the Dalton triplets. 3 lines, everywhere, the mark remained. This mattered because fear was no longer confined to whispers. It had become daily life. Men hesitated to hunt deep in the ridges. Children were forbidden to wander past fence lines. At dusk, families drew curtains tight. though they knew cloth was no shield against girls who moved like phantoms. The triplets' silence had become the holler's curse. By June, a pattern began to reveal itself. Families related to Samuel Dalton, the father who perished in the cabin fire, were marked more often than others. Cousin Jeremiah had vanished. The Perkins barn lay in ashes. The Abbotts had been driven out. But households with no blood tie seemed to suffer only warnings. A dead chicken here, a carved beam there. The holler started to wonder, were the sisters not indiscriminate demons, but calculating avengers? A rare note from a circuit judge passing through on June 12th recorded, "People speak of 3 maidens who punish their own kin. They whisper of justice where the law has none. Yet justice without law becomes terror." The question gnawed at the valley. Were the sisters righting old wrongs, or simply feeding their rage? Neighbors recalled Samuel Dalton's temper, his fists, his belt. They remembered debts unpaid, quarrels left festering. Some muttered that perhaps the girls were settling scores no one else dared touch. But vengeance is a fire. It does not stay contained. On the night of July 1st, lantern light flickered across the creek near the old mill. 3 figures stood together, skirts brushing the water, knives glinting faintly in the moonlight. By morning, the millstones were shattered, split down the middle as though by unnatural force. The village's grain supply dwindled to dust. Without flour, families faced hunger. And still, the sisters watched. What would you do, starving children at your table, knowing food spoiled and tools ruined under their silent gaze? Beg them for mercy or risk open defiance? The holler chose silence again, but silence sharpens like an axe. By mid-July, the triplets no longer needed to carve their sign. Their very presence marked a family. One evening, the Carver widow returned from the creek to find Rosa seated on her porch, sewing calmly with a needle and thread. Ruth and Rebecca stood by the gate, their eyes steady on Sarah's daughters. The widow froze, but no harm came. Instead, when the girls left, she found a loaf of cornbread on her table. Kindness or cruelty in disguise? No one knew. The holler began to fracture. Some saw the sisters as a scourge to be resisted. Others saw them as a dark shield, punishing the cruel and sparing the meek. Old Martha Jenkins whispered, "They're like the mountains take and give in the same breath." On August 10th, the anniversary of the first cabin fire, the sisters struck deeper. That night, the holler filled with 3 sounds at once: dogs barking, children crying, and the slow crackle of fire consuming dry timber. When dawn broke, not 1, but 3 barns lay in ruin, scattered across different ridges, each belonging to a Dalton cousin. This was no accident. It was orchestration. The air smelled of smoke and ash. The ground was littered with blackened tools. Families gathered in fear, realizing the sisters had moved beyond single strikes. They could coordinate destruction across miles in a single night. 3 words echoed again. The sisters watched. A letter from Eli Perkins, written from a neighboring county where he'd fled, reached the holler weeks later. "Leave while you can. They will not stop with barns. Fire spreads. Blood runs downhill." But few could leave. These mountains bound families as tightly as chains. Land passed through generations. To abandon it was to starve. And so they stayed, caught between hunger and fear. By September, the sisters had turned their silence into ritual. Witnesses claimed to see them at dawn on the ridge, standing hand in hand as the sun broke through mist. Their dresses fluttered in wind that seemed not to touch the trees. Some said they prayed. Others swore they cursed the valley. None dared approach close enough to know. And then came the night of September 22nd. A full moon hung low, its light painting the hills silver. The air carried 3 scents at once: kerosene, damp leaves, and blood from a slaughtered deer strung across a fence. Families huddled in cabins, lamps extinguished. But still the light came 3 torches, weaving through the holler like fireflies, too steady to be natural. The torches stopped at the church. By morning, its doors bore the sisters' mark, carved deep into the oak, 3 lines crossing at the center. Inside, the altar cloth had been slashed, the hymnals torn, the cross toppled. No fire, no death, but a desecration more terrifying than flames. If faith itself could be marked, what refuge remained? The preacher stood before the congregation the next Sunday, his voice trembling. "The Lord will protect his flock," he said, though his eyes flicked toward the Dalton clearing. But the benches were half empty. Families had begun drifting away, leaving cabins to rot in the woods. The holler shrank, one household at a time. What remained were those too poor, too bound, or too fearful to leave. They stayed, and they waited. 3 words whispered in every cabin. The sisters watched. The knives and fire were no longer tools of revenge. They had become instruments of dominion. The triplets did not need to speak. The holler itself spoke for them in whispers, in smoke, in silence. And as the autumn leaves began to turn, neighbors realized a darker truth. The sisters were no longer punishing bloodlines. They were claiming the holler itself. The autumn of 1843 bled red across the ridges. Maple leaves fell in showers, carpeting the ground like embers that refused to die. The holler carried 3 scents at once: sweet rot from fallen apples, sharp smoke from distant burn piles, and the faint, oily tang of kerosene that no one admitted leaving out. Nights grew longer, but the silence of the Dalton triplets grew heavier still. The marks on doors and barns had become a language. Families learned to read the sisters' intentions in the depth of each carve, the angle of the lines, even the place where the wood splintered. A shallow mark meant only a warning. A deep cut foretold ruin, and when the 3 lines intersected into a jagged star, families knew to pack what little they owned and flee. This mattered because in Laurel Holler, law no longer came from courthouse or scripture. It came from 3 girls whose words were never spoken. By October, fewer than half the cabins remained occupied. Abandoned homes sagged in weeds, doors left swinging in the wind, chickens scratched in empty yards. The forest crept back, swallowing porches, cracking foundations with roots. And through it all, Rosa, Ruth, and Rebecca walked openly. They passed empty cabins without pause, leaving only footprints in mud. A record from a peddler's log dated October 9th, 1843, reads, "Strange place. Houses stand hollow. Fields gone to seed. Saw 3 maidens in black at dusk. They walked abreast on the road, carrying buckets of water. No one spoke to them. No one dared." Neighbors who remained began negotiating with the sisters in subtle ways. Food left on porches, tools left by creek banks, scraps of cloth folded neatly on fence posts. The items disappeared overnight, never acknowledged, but never returned either. It was tribute, plain and simple. What would you do if silence itself demanded tithes? Resist and risk the fire, or pay and hope the knives passed you by? The holler chose silence again. But silence sharpens like frost. By late October, the sisters no longer confined themselves to the Dalton clearing. They wandered into abandoned homes, leaving behind strange signs. Chairs rearranged in perfect circles, ash spread evenly across floors, mirrors draped with cloth. One family who returned for belongings found a Bible open to the Book of Lamentations. 3 fingerprints smudged across the page. The implication was clear. The holler itself belonged to them now. On the night of All Hallows, neighbors swore they saw fire glow across 3 separate ridges at once. By dawn, cabins belonging to distant Dalton kin lay in ruin, burned, collapsed, their fields salted with ash. Yet in each ruin, one object remained untouched: the family's loom, standing upright, threads uncut. What did it mean? A warning to women? A reminder that the sisters had spun their own fate? No one could agree. Still, the holler knew. The sisters watched. By November, the community reached its breaking point. A meeting was called in the old schoolhouse, the smell of damp pine boards mixing with sweat and fear. Men argued in hushed tones. Should they summon the sheriff again? Appeal to the judge? Or abandon the holler entirely? Old Martha Jenkins raised her cracked voice. You can't put chains on shadows. You can't jail silence. Best you pray the mountains take 'em back. Her words hung in the stale air. No plan was made. The meeting dissolved before midnight. The very next day, the schoolhouse bore the 3-lined mark carved across its door. Inside, the blackboard was smeared with soot, and chalk lay broken on the floor. Children were pulled from lessons. The building never opened again. What happens to a holler when children are no longer taught? Fear grows roots. Memory twists. History itself begins to rot. The triplets had claimed not just houses, but the very tools of community, church, mill, school. What remained for the living? Only survival. And then came the winter storm of December 5th. Snow fell thick as wool, muffling sound, sealing cabins in ice, families huddled by hearths, burning furniture for warmth. In the white hush of night, 3 figures were seen moving through the drifts, their dark shapes stark against the snow. They carried no lanterns, yet their path glowed faintly, as if fire burned beneath the ice. By morning, neighbors discovered new marks, carved not into doors, but into the snow itself. Circles cut deep with knives, surrounding cabins like traps. When the thaw came days later, the circles remained etched into the earth. 3 words, whispered through the storm. The sisters watched. By Christmas, the holler was nearly empty. Those who remained clung to each other, singing hymns with voices hoarse from cold. At midnight service, the preacher dared speak aloud. If they are demons, let the Lord banish them. If they are daughters, let him forgive them. His words echoed off bare rafters. But when the congregation left, 3 lines were carved into the church door once more, deeper than ever. The sisters had heard, and as the year turned, neighbors realized a grim truth. Laurel Holler no longer belonged to them. It belonged to Rosa, Ruth, and Rebecca. The valley itself had bent to their silence. The knives and fire were never the end. They were only the beginning of dominion. The new year of 1844 began with snow melting into mud, turning paths into slick veins that swallowed wagon wheels. The holler smelled of damp pine, wet earth, and the acrid tang of wood smoke curling from the few chimneys still left. Only a handful of families remained too poor to leave, too stubborn to abandon their land. They lived like watchmen on a battlefield already lost. And always, the triplets watched. This mattered because when fear shrinks a community down to its hardest core, survival becomes less about faith and more about compromise. And compromise with silence carries its own price. By January, the sisters no longer needed to carve their sign. Their reputation alone was enough. Families who stayed began leaving gifts at the Dalton clearing. Jars of lard, bolts of cloth, even small amounts of silver hidden in folded handkerchiefs. The offerings vanished each morning. No one saw the sisters take them, but everyone knew. A diary entry from Martha Jenkins, January 15, 1844, reads, "Left corn at the ruin. Gone come sunrise. Heard laughter 3 voices but far away. I thank the Lord they let me be." Yet others were not so fortunate. The Abbott family, who had once mocked the tales, returned to reclaim their land. They lasted 6 nights. On the 7th, their cabin stood with doors wide, embers glowing, but no one inside. The hearth was cold, food still on the table. Their footprints led into the woods and stopped at the frozen creek. Searchers found nothing. Some whispered the sisters had taken them. Others insisted they fled in panic. Either way, the holler grew emptier still. The silence sharpened. By February, It was clear the sisters were not merely punishing kin or neighbors. They were dismantling the holler itself, stripping it of voices until only theirs remained unspoken yet deafening. One evening, Ruth appeared at the Carver place. She knocked once on the door. When Sarah Carver opened it, Ruth handed her a folded scrap of cloth. Inside lay a silver locket, tarnished but intact. Sarah recognized it at once. It had belonged to her mother, lost years before in a fire. She looked up to thank Ruth, but the girl was already gone, melting into the dusk. Kindness? Reminder? Claim of dominion? No one could tell. What would you do? Hold the gift close, or cast it into the creek? The holler chose silence again. 3 words echoed. The sisters watched. By March, the last preacher abandoned his post. He left a note pinned to the church door. Faith cannot dwell where silence reigns. May the Lord forgive this place. After that, no sermons were held. The bell rusted on its beam, the rope frayed, until the wind itself seemed to toll the valley's last prayers. But the sisters were not finished. On April 3rd, neighbors spotted fire blooming on the ridge above the Jenkins place. They rushed to help, but found no house aflame. Only 3 bonfires arranged in a triangle, each burning steady without smoke. In the center lay a circle of stones, and within it 3 chairs from the old schoolhouse, perfectly intact, facing inward. The message was unmistakable. The holler itself had been put on trial. By May, the last families began to vanish. Some fled west toward Kentucky. Others left in the night without farewells. Those who stayed behind reported strange happenings. Doors opening by themselves, animals refusing to enter barns, water turning bitter in buckets. Whether natural or not, the signs carried the sisters' mark. And then came June 13th, the day remembered as the holler silence. At dawn, no rooster crowed. No axe rang from the trees. The air hung heavy with the smell of damp moss and still water. Every cabin door stood ajar, swaying in the breeze. Inside, tables sat with plates half filled, chairs toppled, beds unmade. The families were gone. No footprints led away. No voices carried. The holler was empty, except for the Dalton clearing. That night, smoke rose once more from the ruins of the old cabin. Neighbors watching from distant ridges swore they saw the sisters seated by the fire, their faces lit orange, hands moving as if sewing, or weaving, or cutting cloth. But none dared approach close enough to know for certain. The valley had been erased, not by plague, not by famine, not by war, but by 3 silent daughters whose knives and fire carved silence into every soul. The holler never recovered. And yet, was this truly an ending, or only the beginning of something larger spreading from one valley to the next? Because travelers passing through later that summer claimed to see 3 young women walking a road in Kentucky, their steps in perfect rhythm, their eyes fixed forward. They carried no weapons. They needed none. The sisters had erased one holler, but where would they turn next? Summer deepened in 1844, thick with heat and the drone of cicadas. The abandoned cabins of Laurel Holler sagged under ivy and honeysuckle, their timbers softening with rot. The air carried 3 scents at once: stagnant creek water, wildflowers gone rank, and the faint, ever-present memory of smoke. Travelers avoided the place, muttering of curses, yet the story of the Dalton Triplets spread farther with each passing season. 3 lines, still visible on every door. This mattered because even when people fled, the story stayed behind. And in the absence of living neighbors, tales grew teeth. By autumn, the holler had become a ghost valley. Only a few dared pass through the occasional peddler, a wandering preacher, a fugitive from the law. Each wrote down strange encounters from a journal dated September 12, 1844. Cabins stand hollow, fields eaten by weeds. Saw 3 women by the creek, faces pale as moonlight. They vanished when I called out, but their tracks remained in the mud, 3 pairs, side by side. Others claim the sisters now moved beyond the valley. Stories surfaced in nearby counties, barns mysteriously torched, livestock vanished, whole families relocating without reason. Always, the signs were the same 3 lines carved deep, intersecting like a star. The legend began to divide those who heard it. Some whispered the sisters were angels of justice, punishing cruel men and sparing the meek. Others said they were witches who drew their power from fire and silence. Still others believed they were neither just flesh and blood, girls who learned to wield fear better than any weapon. But fear is a weapon that multiplies. What would you do, hearing such stories in your own holler? Ignore them and risk the fire, or heed them and lock your doors? The holler chose silence again. 3 words carried by rumor. The sisters watched. In 1845, a preacher in Tennessee preached a sermon against them, declaring, "No maiden of Christ walks with knives. No holy child burns barns." Weeks later, his church caught fire during a thunderstorm. No lives were lost, but the congregation found 3 knives stuck in the pulpit afterward. Coincidence or message? The preacher left town soon after. By 1846, the Dalton Triplets had become a story parents told their children at night. Mind your manners, or the silent sisters will come. A tale of warning, yet laced with dread that perhaps it was true. And still, the ruins of Laurel Holler stood. Travelers who wandered through claimed the land felt heavier, as if the air itself pressed down. Some reported hearing laughter carried on the wind, 3 voices, low and melodic. Others swore they saw fire burning in the Dalton clearing, though no wood lay to feed it. Silence had become the holler's only language. A letter from a soldier traveling east in 1847 recorded, "Camped near a place folk called Dalton's Holler. Heard singing, 3 voices in harmony, though no one was there. My horse refused the trail come morning. I will not return." And so the story grew. By 1850, Laurel Holler had been erased from maps, its name replaced with blank ridges and unnamed creeks. Yet still, the marks remained. Hikers decades later would find 3 lines carved into ancient beams, weathered but intact. The knives may have rusted, but the message endured. 3 lines, 3 shadows, 3 sisters. The knives and fire were never the end. They were the beginning of legend, because in the years that followed, the tale of Rosa, Ruth, and Rebecca spread far beyond Appalachia. Some said they died young, swallowed by their own vengeance. Others swore they lived long, wandering from valley to valley, leaving silence in their wake. A few claimed to be descendants, bearing both the burden and the power of their name. Even today, whispers remain. Hikers in the Blue Ridge tell of cabins where no birds sing, doors where 3 lines are still etched deep, nights when 3 figures appear in the tree line and vanish without sound. The holler may be gone, but its silence lingers, because silence sharpens like memory, and memory lives longer than fire. The legend of the Appalachian Triplets has become one of those stories time tried to bury, but could not. It survives in courthouse ledgers, in forgotten journals, in whispered warnings passed down around mountain fires. And perhaps, if you listen close on a still night in those ridges, you might hear it too. 3 voices, singing where no one stands. The holler never recovered, but the story never died. Spring returned to the ridges in 1848, but Laurel Holler did not bloom with it. The forest crept deeper, swallowing paths, collapsing cabins into mossy heaps. Wildflowers grew from what had once been gardens, and the creek carved new channels through abandoned fields. The air carried 3 scents at once: damp pine needles, wild mint, and the faint ash that never seemed to fade from the Dalton clearing. But the silence remained. This mattered because while the holler itself had died, its story had taken root far beyond the mountains. Travelers, peddlers, and preachers carried the tale across county lines, until Rosa, Ruth, and Rebecca became as real in Tennessee or Virginia as they had been in that hidden valley. Every retelling sharpened the legend. Some said the sisters still lived in the ruins, wandering barefoot through fog, their dresses gray with ash. Others swore they had moved on, carrying their knives and fire from valley to valley, leaving silence in their wake. The most chilling stories claimed they could not die at all, that they were bound to the mountains themselves, as enduring as the ridges and hollers. By the 1850s, Laurel Holler was a place marked on no map, but known in every story circle. Hunters avoided its ridges. Children dared one another to walk the old paths, and occasionally, someone returned with strange claims. A letter from a hunter dated October 21st, 1851 reads, "Camped near the Dalton ruin. Heard footsteps outside my tent, though no one was there. At dawn, 3 stones lay in a line by my fire. Left the valley before sun was high. Fear is contagious, but so is memory. What would you do, hearing those footsteps yourself? Run from the hills or risk staying another night?" Most chose silence, but silence sharpens like iron. By the time of the Civil War, the legend of the Triplets carried new weight. Soldiers passing through Appalachia spoke of deserted hollers where no sound carried, where every door bore 3 lines carved deep. Some swore entire regiments went silent after bivouacking near such places, their letters home falling blank, their voices gone. Whether true or not, the story marched with them. The sisters had become larger than life, no longer just avengers of one family. They were shadows of vengeance itself. Their silence was said to punish cruelty, their fire to erase the wicked. Yet others whispered that no one was safe, that the sisters' judgment fell without warning, and silence claimed guilty and innocent alike. The knives and fire had become myth. Still, some fragments of truth endured. A ledger from the county courthouse recorded in 1857. Report received of 3 women passing through Blount County. Did not speak. Paid for supplies with silver dollars marked 1,825. When asked their names, only silence given. Were they the same sisters, older now, or imposters feeding the tale? No one knew. But the $3 coins remained in evidence for years, proof that the story was not all smoke. The decades passed. Laurel Holler grew wild. Trees swallowed the ruins, but hikers in later years still found the marks. 3 lines carved into beams blackened by fire, into stones by the creek, even into living trees that had grown wide around the scars. And the legend refused to die. 3 words persisted. The sisters watched. By the early 20th century, families told the story as a cautionary tale. Mothers warned their children, "Do not lie, do not steal, or the Dalton sisters will come." Campfire tales embroidered the details: glowing eyes, ghostly knives, footsteps in the night. But beneath the embellishments lay a core of truth. Something had happened in Laurel Holler, something too terrible to forget. Even in modern times, hikers report strange experiences: footsteps trailing them on lonely paths, firelight flickering on ridges where no camp exists, 3 knocks on cabin doors at night with no one outside. Always 3, always silence. What if the sisters never left? What if they are still watching, waiting, carrying knives that never rust and fire that never dies? The holler is gone, but the shadow remains. And perhaps that is the truest horror, not the cabins burned or the families vanished, but the silence that still grips the valley. A silence so heavy, it outlived the people who once defied it. The knives and fire were only the beginning. The silence was forever. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.